Listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar. TVN Webinar Series is a regular forum where Canadian and international experts share research and insights on advancements in assessing and caring for frail elderly Canadians. Just to let you know today that the posted PDF version of the slides and the webinar will be available on our TVN website within the next few days. So I have a few announcements that will be coming out this week. There's the 2015 Catalyst Grants. The announcement and the full details will be on our website as well. Just to take note of the deadlines, Monday, October 5th by 5 p.m. is the intent to apply, and Monday, October 9th is the full application is due. We also have transformative research grants already out. They went out, I believe, in August. And again, pardon me, the deadlines are Thursday, October 1st by 5 p.m. and a full application by December 1st. Also new this year is a one-year fellowship. I think we've sent out a few emails to let everybody know that this is coming out, and by the end of the week this will be launched. For further information, please go to our website and we'll have all the details on that. And finally, we have the third annual TVN conference coming up September 27th to 29th. You can register as well by visiting our website, and hope that we can see all of you there. Oh, it wasn't the last one. We also have some TVN presenters at the Canadian Hospital Palliative Care Conference, and they're doing a frailty workshop. It's a morning event, and we hope that you will register and attend. So today's presenters, it's a rehabilitation for frail elderly, models of care and quality indicators. It's a knowledge synthesis project. So the two presenters today is Lora Giangregorio, PhD, an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology at the University of Waterloo, an adjunct scientist at the University Health Network, Toronto Rehab Institute, received her doctorate at McArthur University, and her research focus is to reduce the burden of osteoporotic fractures in high-risk individuals through use of medical imaging technologies that evaluate bone and muscle size density in response to interventions after neurologic injury, evaluate new methods for image analysis, conduct epidemiologic studies that inform fracture and risk assessment algorithms. Sorry for running through that so quickly. And we also have McArthur, a PhD candidate in the Department of Kinesiology at the University of Waterloo. She's a registered physiotherapist with clientele of mostly individuals 65 and over. Her research focus is to improve mobility and quality of life of clinically complex, frail older adults across continuum of care by exploring aspects of physical rehabilitation, including fall prevention strategies, targeted exercise programs, and interventions to improve lifestyle and physical activity. Both of these ladies will be presenting today. They will be taking turns. And I think at the end of the webinar today, we will have a chance to do a Q&A. So please submit your answers online, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Thank you. Can you put the slides over? Caitlin, you can now start.
All right, so thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really excited to be presenting today with Lora the results of our scoping review, and we're also going to present some results from a consensus process we held as well. So I'll just jump right in. So as you may or may not know, residents in long-term care are often complex with multiple morbidities, and often require the support of a multidisciplinary team, including those providing physical rehab. So though we know physical rehab can help improve the function of residents in long-term care, there are questions that still remain around its delivery. For example, there's heterogeneity in the goals of interventions, time allocated to, staff delivering, and the models of delivery of physical rehab. So for example, some interventions may focus on general strength and balance, may be delivered by a physical therapy assistant in a group setting, while others may focus on specific activity of daily living training, may be delivered by a restorative care nurse on an individual basis, which are quite different scenarios. As well, active and passive physical rehab techniques have not been considered to date in one place or in one review. Another issue is what outcomes of physical rehab should we be measuring or have been measured? So most have been measured at the resident level using a wide variety of constructs, elements such as strength, balance, ability to transfer in and out of a chair, while few have looked at the facility level. And while resident level assessment is useful for treatment planning and evaluation, facility level evaluation can allow for comparison between and within long-term care homes and provide support for more quality improvement strategies. So this leads to the question, what about quality indicators? And can we use quality indicators to evaluate physical rehab? Next, who should receive physical rehab in long-term care? So we know there's jurisdictional differences in utilization rates for physical rehab both across Canada and internationally, suggesting that access does not meet the need of residents. As well, there's different categories of residents in long-term care. For example, there's short stay versus long stay residents. So in Canada, the majority of residents are long stay, and long-term care is kind of their final residential place. Whereas in the United States, there's a greater focus on skilled nursing facilities, where residents are often admitted for short stays, and their goal is to return back to the community. In Ontario, there's also been a recent shift with more convalescent care or short stay beds as well. And it's really important to consider the category or the length of stay of residents in long-term care, because this will help determine what their goals of physical rehab will be. So we sought to do a scoping review, and we really wanted to answer 3 research questions to kind of help answer those questions I just identified. So our first research question was, what are the characteristics of physical rehab interventions that have been evaluated in long-term care? Our second question was, which quality indicators and outcomes at person, facility, or system level have been used to evaluate physical rehab? And lastly, which tools exist for decision-making around who is eligible for physical rehab services? Next, we mapped the identified outcomes used onto quality indicators that are currently used in long-term care across Ontario. So these are the quality indicators that are publicly reported by Health Quality Ontario, including the domains of activities of daily living, falls, pressure ulcers, pain, etc. Next, we wanted to consult stakeholders to identify which existing quality indicators could be used to evaluate physical rehab in long-term care, and then putting the two together, use the available evidence and our stakeholder consultation to identify which existing or new quality indicators could be used to evaluate physical rehab. So before I get too far, I just want to put up some definitions so that we're all on the same page about what I'm talking about. So a quality indicator, we used the definition that it's an aggregated resident level data expressed as a fraction, where the numerator is the number of residents with a particular outcome, and the denominator is the number of residents at risk for developing that outcome who are not otherwise excluded. So for example, using a falls quality indicator, the numerator would be the number of residents who fell in the last 90 days, and the denominator would be the number of residents in the long-term care facility who are not otherwise excluded. In terms of physical rehab, we use the definition of physical therapy provided by the Canadian Physiotherapy Association, and it's listed there for you to read. So we included both active, so this would be something like an exercise, or passive physical rehab. So this would be something like a therapeutic modality such as acupuncture or ultrasound. We included things that were delivered in group settings or on an individual basis, and they could be delivered by anyone involved in physical rehab delivery. So physiotherapists, kinesiologists, fitness instructors, nurses, or basically anyone else. So our scoping review, we used the methods described by Arksey and O'Malley, kind of the classic scoping review methodology, and with suggestions by Levac et al., and the references are listed there at the bottom if you're interested. Our key concepts are also listed here for you. We did a comprehensive literature search in 6 licensed databases, and we also did a gray literature search as we really wanted to gather a breadth of information, and we wanted to see if there was any gray literature out there as well. For our inclusion criteria, we basically included anything. So anything from case studies to randomized control trials to clinical practice guidelines to systematic reviews. Participants in the study, at least half of them had to be over the age of 65 and needed to reside in a long-term care facility. And the article had to focus on physical rehab as defined by the Canadian Physiotherapy Association, which was on the previous slide. Before that, actually. And the article had to focus on either a physical rehab intervention, a tool, model, or framework for decision-making regarding eligibility for services, or it had to describe, evaluate, or provide evidence for a quality indicator used to evaluate physical rehab. We excluded tools or models that had not been validated, so this they had to show proof of face, construct, or criterion validity. And we also excluded non-English full-text papers, clinical commentaries, abstracts, or unpublished literature. So just to take you through the flow of articles through our study, our initial search yielded about 13,000 articles, and after we removed duplicates, there was about 6,700. After screening those, we assessed 707 full-text articles, 388 of which were excluded, which means we included 317 articles and 2 reports in our scoping review, and those reports were from the gray literature. In terms of where they fell with our research questions, for research question number 1, there is 316 reported interventions of physical rehab and long-term care. For our second research question, there's 315 articles that reported outcomes of physical rehab and long-term care, 3 articles and 2 reports that described quality indicators, and we found 0 tools or models for determining eligibility. And I should mention that we did find a few articles that described a tool or model, however they were not validated, so they were excluded from the study. All right, so we'll jump into some results. So the first thing we wanted to do was map out where the articles were from in the world, and also the length of stay of residents included in the studies. So you can see here the size of the dot represents the number of articles from that particular country, and then the pie graph within the dot represents the length of stay of the residents with the different colors there. So the majority of the articles were from the United States. In most countries, they did not report the length of stay of residents, and there was very few that actually explicitly included short stay residents, so residents who had been there for up to 90 days, or were only there for up to 90 days. Articles. They were most frequently female, were not bedridden or non-ambulatory, and did not have dementia. And this is really in contrast with residents in long-term care who often have dementia. In terms of characterizing the rehab interventions, they were most frequently delivered at the resident level. As well, physiotherapy time is often quite limited in long-term care, so delivering something on 3 days per week for 45 minutes might not be realistic. In terms of the outcomes measured, the most common outcomes measured were performance-based measures, such as the timed up and go or the Berg Balance Scale, followed by activities of daily living and mood. So you can see that a bit better in this slide here. I'll just orient you to it a bit. At the bottom, you have the domains of the outcomes that were measured, so ranging from performance-based measures on the left to restraint use on the right. And then within each domain of the outcome, we mapped out whether it was measured at the person, facility, or system level. So each domain kind of has that for you. You can see that for all of them, they were mostly measured at the person level, with very few measured at the facility level and even fewer measured at the system level. And then within each bar, you can also see the level of evidence of the article. So whether it was a systematic review of randomized control trials in the navy blue, or a case study in the darker blue at the top of the bars. And then on the y-axis, you have the number of articles. So you can see that the most common outcome or domain of outcome that was reported was performance-based measures. So in the purple boxes, these are the domains of the quality indicators that are currently reported by Health Quality Ontario. So this was kind of part of our mapping exercise of mapping the outcomes onto those quality indicators. As we were abstracting the data, we began to notice that there were other domains that seemed to come up quite often, and those are the ones in the blue. So performance-based measures, mood, quality of life, behaviors, sleep, discharge, and feasibility were kind of the new ones that we found. So now I'm gonna go through the top 6 domains of outcomes and just highlight for you the outcome measures or the tools that were used to measure those outcomes and which ones were used most frequently. So for performance-based measures, the most common tool was a dynamometer to measure something. Usually it was hand grip strength or knee extension strength. The next most common was the timed up and go, followed by walking tests. So this was a variety of walking tests. For example, a 10-meter walking test, a 20-meter walking test. I just kind of grouped them all together because they were usually different lengths. And then chair standing tests was the 4th one. So for example, the 5-time sit to stand or the 30-second sit to stand test as well. So these were the most commonly reported performance-based measures. And again, the bottom 3 there are all about being able to stand up and walk. So you have to think of that relative to the characteristics of the residents in long-term care. So next were activities of daily living. So these were the 4 most common outcome measures used. So the Barthel Index was the first, followed by the Functional Independence Measure, the CATS Index, and then a RIMDS scale, so either the ADL hierarchy scale or the long-form ADL scale. Next was mood. So by far the most common measurement or outcome measure here was the geriatric depression scale, followed by the Philadelphia Geriatric Center Morale Scale, the Cornell Scale of Depression and Dementia, and the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale. For falls, again, by far the most common way of collecting the falls information was via chart review or incident report within the facility, a falls efficacy scale or a fear of falling questionnaire, and then the category of other was just kind of a catch-all for kind of one-off measurements. In terms of quality of life, the short form 12 was the most commonly reported, followed by the Life Satisfaction Index, the EQ5D, and the SF36. And then lastly, for cognition, the most common outcome measures were the MMSE, or the Mini Mental State Exam, a measure of verbal, word, letter, or category fluency, the Wechsler Memory Scale, and the Rivermead Behavioral Memory Test. For the results for the quality indicators, as I mentioned before, we found 3 peer-reviewed articles, 2 were cross-sectional correlational studies, and 1 was a randomized control trial, and 2 grey literature reports. So the quality indicators that were reported within these were activities of daily living, so that was in 3, the prevalence of residents with little or no activity, that was in 2, prevalence of bedridden residents, that was also in 2, and the prevalence of bowel and bladder incontinence, and that was in 2.
Sure.
And then the other ones, there was just 1 for kind of the rest of them. For quality indicators that appeared to be related to physical rehab delivery were decreased range of motion, and that was related to less physical rehab delivery, as you might expect. Lower prevalence of bedridden residents and residents with little or no activity, and then unplanned feed tube placement was also found to be related to PR delivery. However, there was limited evidence to support the use of any one specific quality indicator to evaluate physical rehab in long-term care. 2 peer-reviewed and 1 grey literature report identified where they got their data from, so the source of data derivation, and all 3 of those were from the RIMDS. 1 reported involving a consensus process to develop the quality indicator. 1 reported the prevalence and variance of that quality indicator across a period of time, and none of them reported the sensitivity or time frame for change for the QI in relation to PR. So the conclusion from this slide is that there is not enough evidence in the literature to support the use of any one particular QI to evaluate rehab in long-term care. So we have completed our scoping review. We mapped the identified outcomes onto the quality indicators used in QI, and the next thing we did was we had a consensus process where we consulted stakeholders to identify which existing QIs could be used, as there was really limited evidence in the literature. And then we wanted to put that together to identify which existing or new ones could be used. So I'm going to pass it over to Laura to describe the consensus process to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. So what we wanted to answer in our consensus process was the question, what do you think should be the quality indicators used to evaluate physical rehabilitation in long-term care? We brought together stakeholders from the physical rehab sector and from the long-term care sector, and these included researchers, knowledge users, and individuals who may influence policy as well. And as a start, we had them vote on the QI. So we essentially presented this question to them in a survey format and asked them to answer it independently. So we took their answers and we pooled them together. So we had the results of the online vote. We then brought the stakeholders together in a meeting, so an in-person meeting, and during that meeting we presented the results of the online vote, but before we did that, Caitlin presented a very similar presentation to what you saw today. And the reason for that was we wanted to make sure that the consensus process was informed both by opinion, but also by what is out there and what in the evidence. We actually presented the results of the consensus process so that people could have a sense for what types of measures are actually being used to evaluate rehab in the literature, or what do we know about quality indicators in the literature. So we presented that work first. Then we presented the results of the online voting. And we then had a discussion of both the evidence and the results of the online vote. So we got a sense during the discussion, we asked people, what do you agree with and what do you disagree with? Are there any omissions and why? So that if people were saying, well, you know, I think this outcome should be included and it wasn't there, we wanted them to describe why so that people could make a decision that was informed by their opinion as well as by everything else that had been presented. We then did a re-ranking of the QI, so we had everyone re-vote. So that we could, and we actually during that meeting posted the findings of the revote so that we could then have further discussion in case there was any need to revisit the evidence or opinions. So this is a table that is the results of the online voting. So this is before we had the stakeholder meeting. So we asked people to vote on which quality indicators they thought should be used to evaluate physical rehab and long-term care. And there, you can see along the bottom, we have all of the quality indicators. So when we presented the vote, we actually presented to them, these are the quality indicators that are being used in Ontario. You can either choose one of these or you can suggest others, just so that they were aware of what current quality indicators are. So you can see some of them have a 0, and it's because perhaps people didn't choose the ones that were being used. And these are the quality indicators that are used in long-term care, not necessarily specific to physical rehab. And so you can see all of the quality indicators, either ones that are used by Health Quality or by Health Quality Ontario or other ones that people suggested. And you can see the most common ones were falls, ADLs, pain, and pressure ulcers. We then, as I mentioned, presented the scoping review and then presented the results of the online vote and then had a discussion and then asked them to re-vote. And you can see that after the discussion and the re-vote, there was a shift in the number of people who voted for ADLs and falls as important quality indicators for evaluating physical rehab and long-term care. There was also a slight increase in the number that reported pain. And what's really interesting is that the quality of life was actually added as a potential quality indicator. And pressure ulcers was reported a little less frequently. So I'll highlight there that quality of life was added. It was not present in the initial vote. So some of the themes that emerged from the consensus discussion are listed here, and the first one speaks to the idea that quality indicators may not only be useful on their own, but also in relation to each other. So, for example, if we are able to use physical rehab to reduce pain, that may influence quality of life, or it may influence mobility or ADLs. So we might need to think about how they change in relation to each other. The second was there was a strong discussion about the importance of resident-centered QIs, and I think that's where the quality of life measure or a quality indicator emerged from. And there was also discussion about defining what outcome measures or tools should be used to actually assess the different quality indicators. So how should we define ADL as a quality indicator? Should it be maintenance of activities of daily living, or improvement, for example, or and falls? Is it injurious falls or just falls? And how should we look at quality of life? And that wasn't within the scope of this consensus discussion. We didn't have time to come to consensus on every single one, but it's certainly something that should be discussed or considered in future. So I'll leave it to Caitlin to summarize the key points.
All right, so just to kind of summarize, the majority of the physical rehab interventions in the literature are delivered and evaluated at the person level, with very few looking at the facility or system level. Again, resident level outcomes and delivery is useful for treatment planning and evaluation, but we should also consider looking at the facility and system level just to compare across and within long-term care homes and really provide support for improving the quality of rehabilitative care in long-term care, but also across sectors as well, so in complex continuing care as well as acute care. And rehab as well. So performance-based measures, activities of daily living, and mood were the most frequently reported outcomes. And again, we have to consider whether performance-based measures such as the timed up and go, the ability to walk, or the ability to rise from a chair are perhaps the most important outcomes to look at, and really think of that relative to the characteristics of the residents. Are they able to rise out of a chair, or perhaps bed mobility might capture their goals better. There is limited evidence in the literature to support the use of any particular QI to evaluate physical rehab in long-term care. However, from our consensus process and our stakeholder consultation, the suggested domains for QI evaluation were activities of daily living and falls were kind of the two strong frontrunners. In terms of suggestions for future research, it should really consider the characteristics of residents included in studies and make sure that's reflective of who is actually in long-term care to ensure that our results are generalizable and that they can have practical applications, not just to those higher functioning residents. They should also include comprehensive goals relevant to the characteristics of residents, as well as functional and palliative goals. So as I mentioned, length of stay was often not reported. However, a lot of residents, the vast majority of residents in long-term care in Canada, long-term care is kind of their terminal destination, and rehab does have a role to play in palliation, and so this really should be considered and further explored. As well, we want to consider realistic and sustainable delivery methods, just to make sure that we can actually apply our research. As well, there was no evidence around tools for determining service eligibility. And while we don't want to exclude any residents by having strict eligibility criteria for who should receive rehab in long-term care, it would help make decisions and make things a bit clearer if we could develop something. So I'd like to just thank the team that helped us with the scoping review. They're listed here, as well as our collaborators and knowledge users. We also had assistance from our liaison librarians at the University of Waterloo and our lab members. And we'd like to, of course, acknowledge TVN for providing the funding to complete this project, and all our partners kind of listed at the bottom there with their logos. All right, so I guess I'll open it up for questions. I think we have quite a while to answer some questions.
What are the next steps after this project?
Okay, so I think the question was, what are the next?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, I was on mute there for a second, and I was thanking you for your great presentation. Both of you did a really good job today, and we do have some questions for you. And yes, the first question was, what are the next steps after this project?
Yeah, so I think the next steps are, since we really weren't able to determine the specifications of which quality indicators should be used, especially for activities of daily living, we want to kind of explore which specific quality indicators within those domains could be used by using them to evaluate physical rehab in long-term care, and using them to evaluate a recent funding change in Ontario as well.
Okay. Why did you use such a broad definition of physical rehabilitation?
Yeah, good question. So a scoping review, you generally want to get a broad sense of the literature out there, and we made it even broader by using a broad definition. But we really wanted to acknowledge that rehab is not just a physiotherapist, it's not just a restorative care team, that we wanted to acknowledge everyone who contributes to rehab and long-term care and make sure we were capturing all of that literature together in one place. And it really speaks to the need for kind of interdisciplinary work in rehab and long-term care, which we thought was really important.
Okay. What were the challenges you faced in doing this scoping review?
I think the volume of literature was quite challenging. Initially having about 13,000 articles to go through was quite a lot. So boiling that down to, you know, a few key points that I presented at the end was quite challenging, but it was possible, so that's a bonus. And it was possible with the help of a lot of good team members. So we had co-op students and other HQP helping with the process, and also consulting the team and making sure we were kind of on the right track helped with that as well. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge, was just the volume of literature to go through.
I think I'll add to that that something that was both a challenge and a strength was that because we had so many partners and so many stakeholders, we did a lot of consultation around what should be included, and to the point that after we did our consensus meetings, there were some comments about things that were missing from the review, so we actually had to go back and rerun the search, and I'm saying we, but really it was Caitlin and the team. Caitlin really did lead this, and she did an exceptional job. They had to actually go back and, was it 300 additional articles that you had to screen and abstract?
Yeah.
After rerunning the search based on the stakeholder feedback. So part of the reason why it's so comprehensive is because we were able to consult so many knowledge users and researchers and people involved in the different sectors to get their sense of what should be included. So I'd say that's a challenge because it involved a lot of extra work, but it was also a strength.
Wow, that is a lot of extra work. Why was occupational therapy excluded is one of our questions.
So it wasn't excluded, it was included, as long as it involves something that was deemed as a physical rehab as defined by the Canadian Physiotherapy Association. So there was occupational therapy included. There wasn't that much that was actually found and then also included. But it was included, it just had to involve and there's two team members who kind of screened the abstract and made sure that the intervention fit within the broad definition of physical rehab. So there was a few. I know there's one that was done in the UK that was led by OTs, and it looked at, I can't remember the exact intervention right now, but it was an occupational therapy intervention. So it was actually included. It just didn't. If you saw all of my tables, you would see it there, but I didn't want to overwhelm everybody.
Okay, good answer. Okay, there's a question on, they were curious if you will also be looking at studying supported living, in supported living.
Okay, so yeah, so assisted living kind of situation. So that was actually, I should add that to the challenges, was sometimes it wasn't clear whether the place of residence was supported living or assisted living or long-term care. So that was kind of another gray area / challenge for our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So that leads me to suspect that some of our articles included were actually more of a supported living facility, but based on our inclusion definition of long-term care, they were included in our study. For example, a lot of the articles from Europe, their definition or their description of where people actually lived was kind of a little bit gray, so we just included them anyways. So I suspect that we did actually include some assisted living.
But it wasn't the intention.
It wasn't the intention, no. In terms of if we will look at it in the future, I think it's definitely an interesting thing to consider. And I think there has been some policy changes in Ontario as well with regulation of retirement homes and that kind of thing that I think would lead to looking at an evaluation of that setting as well. So I think down the road, yes, it would be interesting.
We can say for sure that there is a plan as part of Caitlin's PhD thesis to actually look at evaluating the effect of that policy change on physical rehab indicators, and perhaps looking at which indicators change over time or show a change. So that is our, I guess, most the closest or most near project in your future.
Yep.
Okay, good. Was there any data to indicate any subdiagnoses of patient characteristics, i.e. chronic diseases, post-fall, fractured hips, etc.?
Yes, so there was, in the literature, there was little pockets of rehab interventions that were specific to, people who had a fractured hip or people who had Alzheimer's, an Alzheimer's diagnosis or dementia or a diagnosis of dementia. So there was kind of I just kind of summarized everything all together, but there were little pockets of kind of specific diagnoses. Those are the two most common that kind of jumped to my mind was after a hip fracture and after, with Alzheimer's or dementia. The hip fracture piece was more so in the United States in the skilled nursing facilities, and those were those short stay residents where they were really rehabbing them to return to the community. So I can't off the top of my head recall that there was any in long-term care that specifically looked at hip fracture and then staying within the long-term care facility.
But that would probably be consistent with the paper you published looking at who gets rehab in Canada, and it's often individuals who have certain chronic diseases.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the one thing to look at, Caitlin's published paper on that. The other thing to consider would be there are two Cochrane reviews one at physical rehab and long-term care that would specifically look at efficacy, and that would probably speak to what the different chronic disease groups would be.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a review on physical rehabilitation after hip fracture, which would probably include studies done in long-term care.
And there's another Cochrane review of falls prevention involving physical rehab in long-term care and hospital settings that would address the kind of falls issue as well.
There's a good follow-up question, and it's not specific to diseases per se, but this question is: the government requires clear direction on staffing models to implement staffing and changes, and are you able to advocate for a staffing level to provide rehabilitation, i.e. 1.8 PTs for 487 resident beds? Have you come up with anything like that?
So I haven't as of yet, maybe in a little while.
I think you'd have to be able to speak to what works before you can come up with a model, and that wasn't the intent of the review. So the scoping review is to say what is out there, and then usually you would do a systematic review to say what works. So I think that to try to make an inference about a staffing model from the scoping review probably would be inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
But we could certainly speak to what models were there. So we could say these were the types of models that were used, but we couldn't necessarily advocate for one or another because we didn't assess efficacy because that's not the intent of the scoping review. In fact, it was initially part of our plan, but we were advised against it by the reviewers of the initial protocol paper because there are other reviews out there that do that,
mm-hmm.
and also because it makes the scope too broad and it's not really the intent of the scoping review. So perhaps if you read the results of the review when Caitlin publishes them, you'll be able to see sort of what different models you use. And Caitlin did allude to that in the presentation, that a lot of the models that are done in the research studies are very intensive. They're physios coming in 3 times a week and doing small group interventions or even more intense than that. And I doubt that would be realistic in the current context. So I think any inferences we make based on what's out there would probably be unrealistic. Hopefully that answers the question.
Well, and I think the problem, or not the problem, but the gap in the literature is that really we're looking at kind of one-on-one resident to PT relationship and how that we didn't look at it in our study, and we didn't look at the efficacy of it. But what's been studied is that kind of one-on-one relationship, and not necessarily the actual staffing level
or model of care.
Or model of care. Like that hasn't been done yet. So future stuff.
So perhaps that could be a good grant for the transformative review to look at, you know, comparing a cluster randomized trial, comparing models of care and long-term care environments. If anyone wants to take it.
That's good, yes. So here's a good question. For the stakeholder for the stakeholder input, why didn't you include some residents or caregivers without dementia?
Yep, that's a great question, and that's definitely one of the limitations of our consultation, that we weren't able to include residents. It just wasn't in the scope of our meeting to get them there. It's something that I would like to do in the future, and I think that would add a lot of value and speak to that resident-centered piece, because really it was us saying we should be resident-centered, and these are the resident-centered outcomes, but that's not really actually resident-centered, right? So I think in the future that's something that we will add to that or do as a separate project. It just wasn't feasible in the time frame that we had to complete to complete our meeting. So
the other thing that we did do some preliminary work around barriers and facilitators to implementing rehab in long-term care, and thoughts about what should be the outcomes, and we did consult residents at that time. So we did have some feedback from residents around physical rehab and long-term care prior to doing this review, and certainly I would say that review that consultation informed some of the questions that emerged in the review. So I wouldn't necessarily say we didn't include them. We didn't include them in our specific protocol, but their viewpoints were, I would say, represented in sort of how you thought about and designed the review. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, I would say so as well. And I think I would like to consult residents as well to know what quality indicators would be important to them, because that would truly be the resident-centered approach.
Okay. Was there an outcome expected not found in the review?
That's a good question. I'm just thinking. I don't think so. I think there was at least one kind of article for each domain that we kind of had thought of at first. There were, because restraints and emergency department visits, or restraint use, I should say, and emergency department visits were only reported in about 1 or 2 articles, but they were reported. So I think all of the domains that we kind of thought of a priori, which was before we did the study, which were the ones reported by Health Quality Ontario, I think we did find at least 1 article for each of those domains. And then in terms of my thoughts, I was kind of in line with, I thought activities of daily living would be right at the top, and it was. So
I was surprised that pain wasn't featured more frequently.
Yeah.
That was I guess my only surprise.
Yeah. Yeah, so perhaps pain.
Pain, did you say?
Yeah.
I would have thought that pain would have been measured more frequently. It was measured. It's not to say it wasn't included, but it certainly wasn't one of the most common ones.
Mm-hmm. I think I was surprised how frequently mood and quality, pleasantly surprised how frequently mood and quality of life were measured. So that was a bonus for me.
Okay, that's good. Okay, I think we're running out of time, so I'll have one more question. Were there specific ADLs that were more frequently measured than others?
Yeah, great question. So the Barthel Index was the most frequently used, and it measures all of the ADLs if you consider, your early loss, mid-loss, and late-loss ADLs. So early loss being, dressing and personal hygiene, mid being walking and transferring, and late being feeding yourself. So Barthel measures all of those. So that was measured most commonly. I can't say that any one of those was measured because they weren't measured independently. If not, they'd be kind of under the performance-based measures. So, you know, if it was transferring, it would be probably captured, if they're only measuring that, it would have been captured in something like the timed up and go or the ability to rise from the chair, or simply an ability to transfer yes or no kind of thing. So I don't know that any one particular ADL was measured more than others, and that's kind of the question that's still remaining. As Laura mentioned, what specifically to measure. So we know ADLs as the domain was the most important, but is it preventing decline in ADLs or is it improving ADLs? But then is it also, you know, those early loss, mid loss, or late loss ADLs? We don't really know. So again, more future work for our team.
And I think part of answering that question would be understanding what would be important in the long-term care setting. So it might be that many of the residents in long-term care, you know, the early loss, they may have already experienced the early loss and we're working on the mid-loss. Or, you know, it's hard to know where many of them stand and or who would get the rehab. So would it be the people who have the early loss that are getting the rehab, or is it more than me? So you'd have to really think about who you actually are saying needs the rehab as well, in order to be able to define what outcomes you're measuring. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense, but that's something that we've thought a lot, we were thinking a lot about is you have to think about the characteristics of the people in long-term care, then those characteristics of the people who are likely to get rehab, and at what level of ADL function or abilities are they at, so to be able to define how you want to measure change.
Yeah, so are you preventing them from transitioning from mid-loss to late-loss ADLs, or are you, you know, improving them from their in mid-loss to early loss? So, yeah, that's a long answer for no. There wasn't any one particular ADL that was measured that really stuck out.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much for answering all those questions, and thanks everyone for participating in the webinar. We did get a lot of questions. We can't go through all of them, but I think we've gotten at least 50% of the way through them. Anyhow, thanks again. Just to go through, we do want to improve our webinars, so there's a brief survey that should pop up on your screen, and if you could provide us with feedback, that would be great. And there's webinars scheduled in September. There's a TVN MyTex Accelerate information session. That will be for HQPs, researchers, NPOs, not-for-profit organizations that want to take on trainees to participate in this program. It does stretch your dollars, so if you're interested in that, that's tomorrow at noon. And Wednesday, September 16th at noon is the Assessing Quality of Life Measures for Elderly Traumatic Brain Injury Survivors. And to register, follow us on Twitter, and all the slides and the webinar today will be up by the end of the week on our website. So thank you very much, and have a good day. Goodbye.
We would like to thank you for having us.
Oh, we're so glad to have you. Thanks. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.